Hello everybody and welcome back again. Today we're going to be looking at Midnight Coup and comparing it to some of the other popular legendary kinetic hand cannons, in this case Fatebringer, which I think is still one of the most popular, well-regarded kinetic hand cannons in the game. Like I mentioned in the other video that I uploaded at the same time as this one, it's almost like a soft two-part review since both are talking about legendary hand cannons. You don't need to watch one to understand the other. If you would like to check out the other one, it's about Luna's Howl with a little bit of a comparison to Zuli's Bane, similar to this one. I would greatly appreciate if you go watch it, but if you don't want to, I completely understand. But if you do like these videos or find them helpful, like, subscribe, follow on Twitch, all greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much for watching. Let's not waste any more of your time, and let's look at Midnight Coup and Fatebringer. On your screen now is the perk pool for Midnight Coup, the version specifically coming from the Brave Arsenal, of course. And this one, I think, is actually a pretty solid perk pool. For the first column, my personal favorite is actually going to be Firefly. I think Firefly is a very solid choice here. And then in the fourth column, I think there's a few good choices. I like Rampage, One for All, and Frenzy. That's just my personal preference. I've seen some people argue for Desperate Measures, and I do think Desperate Measures is a decent choice. It's just not my personal favorite. And yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot else crazy going on here. Things like Explosive Payload are also perfectly fine on this weapon. But I think Firefly is just such a valuable perk on a kinetic weapon that it is my personal choice. And then I've been using one with Rampage. That's my personal preference. Although I also used one with One for All and Frenzy for the purposes of making this video, and I thought they were very, very, very good. The number one perk that I think is just straight up bait on this weapon, though, is, in my opinion, Kinetic Trimmers. Normally, I'm a huge advocate for Kinetic Trimmers on kinetic weapons. I love it on pulses, I love it on scouts. I do not love it on hand cannons. The main reason is that hand cannons take 6 shots to activate Kinetic Trimmers. It's going to be 5 with the enhanced version. But if you need that many shots, then maybe you shouldn't be shooting that target with a hand cannon. And on Midnight Coup specifically, it's just too much of your magazine. You're burning too many shots to get Kinetic Trimmers and not a whole lot else out of it. So I usually recommend against Kinetic Trimmers for this weapon. I don't think it's the worst thing you could pick, but it's not something that I personally will be using, even though it has the combo of shoot loot Kinetic Trimmers, which I personally love on a ton of weapons. Legendary Scouts, Legendary Pulses, all rolling with these, I actually think is really good, but it's not my cup of tea for a hand cannon. But then I think it is worth comparing this to Fatebringer, because like I said, I'm still pretty confident saying that most people would say Fatebringer is probably their favorite kinetic hand cannon, at least before the release of the new Midnight Coup. And Fatebringer, despite being a few years old, has actually aged pretty well. It's super, super strong, which not a lot of weapons in Destiny really do with all the new perks that get added. But Fatebringer has good stats, and the perks that it does roll with are perks that are still arguably very good in the modern sandbox. Things like Firefly, Explosive Payload, Frenzy, all of these are still very, very common on hand cannons today for some of the popular perks you'll see. Fatebringer, however, also does not have access to enhanced perks. It predates that by quite a bit, and Midnight Coup will when Final Shape releases and these weapons are enhanceable. So I do think that is a point for Midnight Coup in this case, as well as the fact that Midnight Coup has an origin trait. I'm not the biggest fan of the Indomitable origin trait. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's good. I usually look at origin traits as like a bonus. Most of the time, they're awesome. They're great. But some of them can kind of be ignored. Things like the Gambit origin trait are kind of useless in my opinion. And while I don't think Indomitable is useless, it's not super noticeable in my opinion. So it's not my favorite, it's not bad. I don't really count it against Midnight Coup because it is basically an extra perk slot that Fatebringer doesn't have here. And the other thing is you can get really similar rolls to Fatebringer on Midnight Coup. And while you can't get the super iconic Fatebringer Explosive Payload's Firefly roll, since Explosive Payload and Firefly are in the same column for Midnight Coup, you could do Firefly with Rampage, which I think is really similar to something that I would like to see on Fatebringer if it gets brought back in the future. One for All, also a great damage perk, like I mentioned earlier, and then Frenzy, also a great damage perk, like I mentioned earlier. But these combinations of like double damage perks I think are really, really good. It's something I would fully expect Fatebringer to get in the future should they bring it back, and it's kind of here now in Midnight Coup. So I do think it is an upgrade, even though they're both really, really solid. I don't necessarily think if you like your Fatebringer, it needs to be replaced with a Midnight Coup. I just think if you are somebody who's always looking to upgrade their loadouts like me, then Midnight Coup is a natural step up from Fatebringer. If you use and like Fatebringer, you will settle in very, very easily with Midnight Coup, and I think it will give you a lot of mileage like your Fatebringer probably has at this point. The other thing is, I know Fatebringer does have an Adept version. I know it's the Time Lost Fatebringer. Adept mods really only matter for PvP on these weapons, in my opinion. While Adept Big One spec is awesome for PvE, it is borderline useless on primary weapons since you're probably going to be running minor spec, and there does not exist an Adept mod that combines minor and major spec, only Adept Big Ones, which combines major and boss spec. So I really don't think the Fatebringer having an Adept variant gives it an edge in PvE. I would even say that Midnight Coup having a future where it gets enhanced perks is a little better, because I do think enhanceable perks is better than Adept Weapon in PvE in the cases where you cannot get enhanceable perks on the Adept weapons on some of the older Adept weapons in PvE currently. Naturally, that does include the Time Lost Fatebringer, although I imagine in the future, if Vault of Glass gets a loot refresh, the new Adepts will probably be enhanceable. But we shall see, because again, that is completely my own speculation. So, just in conclusion, I do think both of these are very solid hand cannons. I think a kinetic hand cannon is very, very easy to fit into a build for just about any subclass. I think that, again, both are great. I like Midnight Coup a little more, just given the modern perks and the double damage perks that it does have available. If you are a Fatebringer fan, Midnight Coup will not disappoint you, but I do not think you need to trash your Fatebringer just to replace it with a Midnight Coup. I still have both of mine. Probably going to use the Midnight Coup more going forward, but there are some niche cases where I think the Fatebringer will still be good. A great example is like Overload Champions. Overload Hand Cannon requires hits in order to proc. And while Midnight could roll something like Explosive Payload 1-for-all, Explosive Payload Frenzy, that I think would be very good in something like a Grandmaster, Fatebringer having Explosive Payload and Firefly I think is a great combo for even higher end content, because if you don't know, Explosive Payload counts as 2 hits for Overload Hand Cannon. You're able to much easier activate Overload Hand Cannon, and I still think Fatebringer's combos are a little better for that niche case. But I think both are still very solid, and whichever one you prefer personally, I think is perfectly fine to use. I do not think there's one that is a clear winner over the other than the natural, obvious things like Midnight Coup is a newer, Midnight Coup has an origin trait, things like that. I imagine once Vogue weapons get an origin trait, Fatebringer may be better. It just depends on what the new perks it gets are. Well, I will not waste any more of y'all's time. Like I said in the beginning of this video, I did also upload at the same time a video on Luna's Howl, and compared it pretty closely to Zuli's Bane. I did go a little more in depth in that one, I think, because it had some solar synergies that I want to talk about, and some class-specific things. Whereas this is a much more general review. I don't think there's a whole lot else to say about these two hand cannons specifically. So if you liked this or found it helpful and want to check that out, it will be essentially there on my channel if you want to see it. If not, perfectly understandable. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Later, everybody.